Hello everybody, my name is Kerbunny, and today we're going to take a look at some illustrations produced for the Nintendo 64's pair of Zelda games. This video is only the third in the Render Reviews series, yet we're already deviating from the formula. Unlike the N64-Era Mario games and the Donkey Kong Country series, neither Ocarina of Time nor Majora's Mask relied on fancy 3D models to capture audiences' attention. They instead used traditional, hand-drawn artwork to bring the worlds of Hyrule and Termina to life. Both games' illustrations were created by Yusuke Nakano, who went on to work on several future Zelda titles and eventually produced Super Smash Bros. Ultimate's panoramic artwork. According to Zelda Wiki's summary of information from The Legend of Zelda Art and Artifacts, Nakano initially pushed for Nintendo to produce 3D renders of Ocarina of Time's characters, but for one reason or another, eventually decided to draw everything himself. And thus he bestowed upon us the beautiful artwork that we're going to discuss today. Between the small number of games in question and the fact that drawings have existed for dozens of millennia longer than 3D models, I seriously debated whether I should even try to cover these illustrations. Still, a few people expressed interest in the topic, and I, as always, have plenty to say. Before we get started, I want to express my infinite gratitude for History of Hyrule, whose tireless archival efforts have made nearly 4 decades worth of the Zelda series artwork easily accessible and, for my purposes, downloadable. Seriously, incredible work. As usual, my only contribution to our collective fascination with old renders and illustrations is the video that you're watching right now. I'm going to leave a few links to History of Hyrule's pages in the description, and I highly encourage you to check them out. Now that we're done with the introductory housekeeping, let's dive in. Ocarina of Time first, then Majora's Mask. Ocarina of Time's illustrations boast crisp, precise line work and vibrant colors. In these iconic shots of Link, for example, the green on his tunic and the accents on his equipment really pop. Both versions also have strong, purposeful poses and relatively realistic proportions. While the huge eyes and thick, swooping clumps of hair scream anime, I think the art style is a bit more complex than that. Its reliance on bright colors and soft shadows gives the illustrations an idyllic quality that would feel more at home in a picture book or on the cover of a middle-grade fantasy novel. The best comparisons that immediately jump to mind are the covers of the Warrior Cat books. Hey, don't judge, I read them to impress a girl. The point is that the art style elicits a sense of wonder and encourages viewers to see more of what Hyrule has to offer. Link received an illustration for pretty much every major action available in Ocarina of Time, much like Mario did for his N64 debut. In both cases, the unprecedented complexity of their movesets probably prompted Nintendo to leave no room for ambiguity. The vast majority of the images in this set feature adult Link, which makes sense because the bulk of the game does take place in his timeline. He looks fairly consistent from image to image. The only real exception is his nose, which drastically varies in size and shape. My favorite shot is this one of him and Navi taking a brief rest. Also, shoutouts to this shot for becoming the de facto box art for Ocarina of Time's various GameCube re-releases. Zelda received little attention in terms of standalone artwork. We have one picture of young Zelda, one picture of adult Zelda, and one picture of Sheik. Both versions of Zelda have impressive levels of detail on their accessories. I can't even begin to imagine drawing something like her pauldrons or belt without smudging something. Sheik's design is much less intricate, so the only things that I really want to mention are her boots. I think they're supposed to be Jika Tabi, which are shoes with a split-toe design that, allegedly, promotes balance and maneuverability. I never would have gleaned that from these 5-polygon clodhoppers, but alright. Ganondorf received even less standalone attention than Zelda did. We only have one shot of the man and one of the beast. Ganondorf's outfit is just as meticulously detailed as Zelda's, although no amount of artistry could make his extremely short cape look any less ridiculous. Also, I just noticed that he carries a knife in a thigh holster. As for Ganon, it's nice to get an extended look at him. His only in-game appearance is so atmospheric and stressful that you can't afford to stand around and appreciate his design. His snarling face and muscular limbs show that he really isn't messing around, and his gross, stringy hair and tattered cape indicate that he's simultaneously on the ropes and unconcerned about anything other than winning. I do have one nitpick. The scale of his swords seems wrong. I think they're supposed to be roughly as long as Link is tall, but they look more like daggers here. Maybe that's just because I lack a frame of reference. There, that's better. Now that we've seen the 3 holders of the Triforce, it's time to move on to the side characters and enemies. I'm gonna look at the location-agnostic fellows first, then bounce around Hyrule in the generally accepted order of the medallions. Malon's and Talon's Bowser brooches are much easier to spot when rendered by a pencil instead of whatever toaster was responsible for the N64's texture filtering. I like the patched-up knees on Talon's outfit. They show that, despite his affinity for sleep, he does at least enough manual labor to wear his clothes out. Ingo's outfit sports similar, if less severe, decay. Malon's artwork perfectly conveys her in-game role of standing around and studying Link with those massive eyes. I think it's kind of funny that her pose is the most amateur thing imaginable. My middle school-aged self used the exact same maneuvers while trying and failing to learn how to draw. As the old saying goes, those who can't do, create long-form YouTube videos to discuss. Moving on to the enemies, we have several illustrations that accomplish their goals without being too remarkable. There are only a few standouts that I want to highlight here. I quite like the tattered leaves on this Deku Baba. They make it seem all the more feral. Lizalfos look infinitely better in the artwork than they do in the game itself. It's not even close. I might as well be fighting Kermit in Dodongo's cavern. This Stalfos looks awesome as well. I've always been a fan of the jagged, rusty sword. If the stab doesn't kill you, the tetanus will. I also like how its pants don't fit its emaciated body at all. They just float there, keeping their owner decent through sheer force of will alone. Our trek through the various regions of Hyrule gets off to a low-key start, as the only character tied to the Temple of Light is Rauru. My sole observation is that I can't stop seeing his double chin as him smirking without his dentures in. And now you can't either. We also have 2 very similar shots of Rauru's avian avatar, Kaepora Gaebora. There isn't much of a resemblance beyond a few traits inherent to every other wise old mentor in fiction. Let's just move on to the forest. Here we have Saria, whose hair looks quite a bit darker than it does in-game. Everything else about her design is on point at least. The turtleneck adds a bit of visual interest that the other Kokiri lack. And speaking of the other Kokiri, here's a collection of 5. Fado's hair looks blurry, as if it had a bad encounter with Photoshop's smudge tool. The fact that the male Kokiri's tunics have tattered edges while Link's doesn't is fascinating. I could go on about how this choice potentially carries some symbolism about his inherent inability to fit in with the Kokiri, but I'd rather talk about how the shopkeeper looks like a bigger snob than Mido instead. Here we have a neutral party in the form of a Skull Kid with and without the skull mask. I quite like how his outfit's earthy tones contrast with accents of a much brighter, livelier green. This Deku scrub would make for an excellent coffee table, if the rich color and texture of its body are any indication. The teal saliva stuck to its recently launched Deku Nut is much less aesthetically pleasing. It makes sense, but still, yuck. It feels weird to treat Moblins as a grass-type enemy, but it's not my fault that they only appeared in the Sacred Forest meadow. The version with the spear has some immediately obvious combat expertise, while the one with the club is absolutely jacked. Seriously, what a unit. I would have liked to fight these guys in a capacity greater than sneak around and backstab them. As was the case with Ganon's illustration, I appreciate Goma's for providing us with a much more detailed, sustained look at her. I'm almost sad that such a terrifying design was quote-unquote wasted on a tutorial boss who most people kill in 1 or 2 cycles. Our final denizen of the forest is Phantom Ganon, whose artwork I absolutely unequivocally love. The demonic horse, with its fiery mane and midnight blue skin, is just as much of an attraction as the man himself. Also, I just noticed that Phantom Ganon's mouth is seemingly sewn shut. I can't say whether it was like that when Ganondorf summoned him from hell, or if Ganondorf did it himself to ensure obedience. Either way, it's a horrifying thought. Death Mountain gives us a bit less to work with. The Gorons are here, complete with their placid grins and random, minor tufts of hair. Darunia has a super intimidating stature that doesn't quite come across in-game, especially since he spends most of his time either moping or dancing. Here, though, he looks like he's very ready and very able to punch a guy's head off at any moment. Let's make him fight the Moblin with the club. It'll be the battle of the century. We also have illustrations of the various stages of a Dodongo's life cycle. I'm intrigued by the cluster of crystals that seems to be growing out of King Dodongo's shoulder. It has a bunch of prominent veins running across and out of it, implying that it's somehow an organic part of him. I guess it's like how Gorons grow rocks out of their backs. As for the other boss native to Death Mountain, Volvagia looks pretty slick. It's basically a fire-type Rayquaza. How could I not love it? The cracked volcanic texture on its back is a nice way to further emphasize its mastery of fire. Zora's domain and Lake Hylia are up next. King Zora looks a bit less miserable and deflated in his illustration, although I'm still not a huge fan of his helpless, Humpty Dumpty-esque design. As for the regularly sized Zoras, I have to laugh at how unimpressive the generic males look in comparison to Ruto. The former have soulless, empty eyes and fins you could draw in a single stroke, whereas the latter has a much more human-like face and frillier fins. She truly embodies those spot the anime protagonist in a crowd memes. Big Octo received an illustration, and he looks so sad, as miserable as a blobfish even. And now that I've successfully made you pity Jabu Jabu's mini-boss, I would be in a perfect position to discuss artwork of the Water Temple's mini-boss, Dark Link. If there was any! Seriously, what? The coolest mini-boss with the coolest arena, the combination of which inspired countless pieces of fan art, that are only sometimes homoerotic, received nothing official. That's crazy to me. There isn't much to say about the bosses. Baronade certainly looks like a gross tumor that grew way out of control, and Morpha has some nice reflections throughout its coil. Honestly, I've never liked either of these things. They're just writhing masses of stuff, whereas the other bosses are, at the very least, distinct entities. Kakariko Village and the Shadow Temple have two, count 'em, two, pieces of associated artwork. The first belongs to Impa. I don't quite see how a solid slab of metal that only covers the front of her torso is supposed to offer protection or assist in sneaking around, but I'm also not a ninja. And speaking of ninjas, note how her shoes are similar to Sheik's. This version of Impa is my second favorite overall, just a few paces behind the Age of Calamity version. Our second and final illustration belongs to Bongo Bongo. The stumps at the ends of its wrists look surprisingly gruesome, and its spine looks warped from years of hanging upside down and jerking around. These elements nicely capture the darkness and mystery surrounding Kakariko's pair of dungeons. Of course, this image omits the one thing that significantly detracts from Bongo Bongo's intimidating nature, the bongo. What a weird gimmick to saddle such an otherwise wretched creature with. Our next stop is Gerudo Desert, where we can find some generic guards and Nabaru. The guard's rich midnight purple outfit serves as a great contrast to the desert's yellows and browns. Nabaru's various shades of red and pink are beautiful as well. I once again need to commend the jewelry's intricacy, and something about the wispy texture of her hair speaks to me in a way that someone like Zelda's doesn't. We also have an image of Nabaru as an iron knuckle. Again, we seriously got artwork for this encounter, but not Dark Link's. My memory typically blurs the designs of Nabaru's armor and the standard iron knuckles together, but the differences are obvious now that I'm looking at them side by side. I like how Nabaru's helmet has a version of the standard issue Gerudo forehead gem attached to it. This lever has a lot of anatomical detail, and I like none of it. Just kill it with fire. Koome and Kotake are unremarkable beyond the fact that I keep seeing Mr. Burns and or Igor whenever I look at them. The main attraction is Twinrova, whose generally darker palette causes the fire and ice effects to pop. I like how her shoes, sash, and hairbands have perfectly mirrored colors to keep the fusion balanced. Also, I just noticed that her wands are actually Koome and Kotake's brooms. Now that we've finally escaped from the standalone character illustrations, it's time to look at some scenes. Let's start with this shot of Link drawing the Master Sword from its pedestal. The lower angle emphasizes the Temple of Time's grandiosity, and the harsh blue raspberry-flavored lighting adds to the moment's intensity. The fact that Link and the sword are roughly the same height proves Raru's assertion that the former really was not ready to wield the latter. This shot of Link annihilating a pair of Dekubabas looks incredible with the fiery arc of the spin attack and the deep purple background. As a brief historical aside, this image appeared on the cover of a short and sweet Ocarina of Time tie-in novel titled Link and the Portal of Doom. Hi, Future Kerbunny here. No, it didn't. This image is similar, but obviously not the same. What the hell am I talking about? I think it was about Link trying to stop a black hole from eating Hyrule. I'm fuzzy on the specifics. I'm gonna have to make a video about this thing, aren't I? I'll add it to the list. Next up is a nice picture of Link and Zelda sitting in the grass. It's most likely an interpretation of Zelda's exposition dump in the courtyard, but something about it gives me a strong, heartwarming, alternate universe fanfic vibe. I don't know. Between the gentle, extra watercolory tones and the characters' relaxed poses, it seems too serene to fit anywhere in a plot that consists of people constantly telling Link to go places before Ganondorf can end the world. These images are extremely tough to look at. Everything just looks super muddy. Once again, it looks like someone went crazy with the smudge tool. What even happened here? I think the shot of Link in Volvagia is the better one of the two, but it's still not great. Thankfully, the rest of the scenes featuring adult Link kick all sorts of ass. First up is this shot of the game's penultimate boss battle. It gives us our first and only look at Ganondorf's future incarnation. I like how he's pulling a Smash Bros and outright brawling with Link with no regard for the sword nor the shield. The shot of Link and Sheik playing their respective instruments in the ice cavern is downright gorgeous. It's nice to see them huddle up and seize a few moments of peace together. The background's icy tones and the sparkling crystals near the ceiling make the scene feel truly magical. If I had a nickel for every shot of Sheik that took my breath away, I would have 2 nickels, and I would gladly accept more. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, here we can see Link and Sheik in the middle of a very Doom-esque scenario. The foreground provides a rare view of Ganondorf's forces in action, while the background looks super slick with additional distant enemies silhouetted against the scarlet sky. A scene like this would have been super satisfying to experience in-game. Unfortunately, we live in the reality in which Sheik's only combat scene involves her getting ragdolled by Bongo Bongo's ghostly fizz gun. Before we move on to our last pair of scenes, I want to draw attention to Navi's appearance in these 3 images. She usually turns yellow when targeting enemies, but she's bright red here. I have 2 major takeaways. Number 1, Black War Greymon's Terra Destroyer. If I just activated some long dormant neurons with that reference, be sure to let me know in the comments. I love doing that to people. Second, and more importantly, Navi did turn red when targeting enemies at one point in the game's development. See this grainy screenshot from the cutting room floor. It's interesting to think about how the development team's workflow somehow caused this minor detail to persist in the finalized artwork. I have mixed feelings about this two-sided piece. On one hand, it effectively captures the urgency and the gloomy vibes of the child and adult timelines respectively, as well as the game's overall epic tone. Even so, it suffers from the floating head syndrome that plagues most modern movie posters. Link and Zelda are on here 3 times each, and the trio of Stalfos only exists to fill space. An earlier version of this illustration was revealed in Hyrule Historia. While I don't want to veer too far into the realm of concept art in this video, since that would get very out of hand very quickly, I do want to discuss this specific piece. It's super cool to see things like an earlier, slightly more angular Ganondorf, a humanoid Navi, an unmasked Sheik, and a Stalfos with a much bulkier and more intimidating set of armor. The Master Sword's existence as the divider between the image's 2 halves is thematically appropriate, since it serves the same mechanical purpose in the game itself. This image doesn't do much with the idea, though, since the only element exclusive to young Link's timeline is young Link. The cutting room floor has a more in-depth breakdown of this image and what it implies about the state of the development process at the time of its creation, so check the description for a link to that if you're curious. The only other scenes of note are these sketches of the dungeons and some other prominent objects and locales. These images, more than almost any of the others discussed thus far, perfectly embody the bright, fantastical vibes that I described earlier. My favorites are this shot of Kakariko's windmill and this one of the Spirit Temple's entrance. Conversely, I have to admit that these shots of Dodongo's Cavern, the Sacred Forest Meadow, and Lake Hylia look awfully artificial. The in-game versions are a bit easier to swallow, since the more simplistic graphics and the game's inherent interactivity make it easier to suspend one's disbelief. When those factors are replaced with an artist's interpretation, the oddly shaped natural features and conveniently placed props begin to look much more suspicious. Next, I want to briefly touch on the few 3D renders that do exist for Ocarina of Time. First, I have to acknowledge this unofficial model of Link that appeared on the cover of Electronic Gaming Monthly in December 1998. It speaks for itself. Could I do better? No. Do I still feel nauseous? Absolutely. If you want to see 3D versions of the game's main cast, just gawk at their trophies in Super Smash Bros. Melee. They use the same poses as their official artwork, so they're as close as we'll ever get. The real meat of this section is this series of full-resolution renders of the game's equipable items. This collection of assets was but one of many that became available via the Giga Leak, in which a treasure trove of classified material tied to Nintendo's games and hardware landed on the internet in early 2018 and, more famously, mid-2020. Many of these assets appeared in printed materials like instruction manuals and player's guides, but Nintendo never made them publicly available because who really needs an up-close and personal look at the magic beans? The answer is me. I'm thinking about those beans. They look like the world's most delectable candy. It's no wonder that the maniac near the front end of Zora's River couldn't stop eating them. The potions also look delicious. While their main purpose is to restore health and/or magic, I bet they would taste sweet and refreshing on the way down. No, this video is not sponsored by Granny's Potion Shop. As we learned in the previous two videos, 3D models from this era were infinitely more likely to look sleek and shiny than not. Consequently, items made of metal or glass look great. Shoutouts to the hookshot, longshot, gauntlets, lens of truth, boss key, and magic spells in particular. The crystalline portions of the fire, ice, and light arrows also look great in this regard. I also like the Ocarina of Time's sleekness, especially since it creates a nice contrast with the much rougher, handmade texture of the fairy ocarina. I think the Deku Sticks render is the only truly bad one. That texture certainly resembles something, but it ain't wood. I could talk about these renders all day, so I should probably wrap this section up. The last thing I'll draw attention to is this derpy render of the eyeball frog. I love him dearly, albeit not as much as I love Bigoron's sword. Sorry, little guy. Before I move on to Majora's Mask, I want to cover the small amount of artwork produced for Ocarina of Time 3D. I kept going back and forth on whether I wanted to do this or not, but there are so few images that their inclusion in a theoretical reviewing artwork from handheld Zelda games video would amount to little more than a footnote. The remake's main contribution was some fresh artwork for the main trio. These shots use a more painterly style than we've seen before. Ganondorf's is the most visually impressive by far. It boasts a ton of detail, much like its equivalent from the original game, and something about the red cape just does it for me. Link and Zelda look perfectly adequate, although something about the latter's nose looks weird. Ocarina of Time 3D also gave us this render of Hyrule Field. Now this is what I like to see. The pastel blues and pinks in the sky, the god rays emerging from the distant sunrise, and the sheer scale of Death Mountain and its less lethal brethren emphasize the majesty of Hyrule. Adult Link's presence is a bit anachronistic, since the kingdom had already gone to shit by the time he woke up and acquired Epona, but I don't particularly care. This image had a place of honor in my wallpaper rotation back on Windows 7. So did a couple of other shots from Ocarina of Time now that I think about it, but I specifically remembered this one because it's just so impressive. When I started working on this video, one of my main fears was that Ocarina of Time's section would end up being significantly longer than Majora's Mask's. After all, I've played much more of the former and therefore have much more to say. And yeah, this video is a bit unbalanced, but it isn't entirely my fault. Majora's Mask simply has much less artwork to go around. Majora's Mask uses an art style very similar to its predecessors. One of the few major differences is the use of much darker shadows. In this shot from Ocarina of Time, the shadows dim the underlying colors and, in most cases, gradually fade away as they get closer to direct sunlight. Meanwhile, a sizable percentage of this shot from Majora's Mask is pitch black. We're talking 6 zeros in hexadecimal here. I like it. Majora's Mask's use of aggressive, comic booky shading is highly appropriate for a game with such a dour tone. Nakano reportedly borrowed this stylistic choice from Hellboy of all things. Another notable change is that most characters' heads are slightly larger in proportion to their bodies. This choice gives the illustrations an even more stylized look and, in my opinion, looks like a quarter step toward the much cuter, almost chibi style used in Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Most characters survived this change unscathed, although a few, namely Cremia, wound up with gigantic heads that look way too heavy. Link received a few new illustrations, albeit nothing close to the comprehensive set that his adult counterpart received for Ocarina of Time. I like how this shot gives the Razor Sword a bit of rare acknowledgement. The illustrations of Link's three main transformations are the truly interesting ones. Deku Link seems a bit sad, understandably so given everything that happened at the start of the game, whereas Goron Link and Zora Link exude the confusion and stoicism of generic members of their respective species. I'm not a fan of how we only have these static poses to work with. The transformations are super important to the gameplay, so it would have been nice to get some extra action shots. But I guess you have to be selective when you're expected to develop a whole-ass game in a year. Oh, we also have a shot of Fierce Deity Link, but everyone already knows that this design is badass. I have nothing to add on that front. Moving on to the game's antagonists, Skull Kid looks a bit more slender than he did in his earlier artwork, and his clothes lack the exaggerated leafy texture. The muted tones of his outfit emphasize the rich colors and sinister glowing eyes of Majora's Mask. The Happy Mask Salesman definitely looks shifty, albeit not as much as he does in-game due to the lack of N64-induced sharpness on his face. Plus, a still image can't creepily laugh at me. Okay, I stand corrected. This shot is also notable because it, much like Malon's and Talon's illustrations from Ocarina of Time, makes the Mario reference infinitely more apparent. Also visible are masks of Darth Maul, the Cragheart from Gloomhaven, and the Fonz? Now that would be an interesting selection of transformation masks. The boss's illustrations are where the series' penchant for intricate detail really comes back into play. Take Adalwa, for example. His mask and headdress sport a bunch of colorful markings, and his orange and blue war paint actually adheres to the curves of his muscles. Goat looks even more impressive. His body sports so many gears and tubes that aren't even slightly visible on his comparatively flat, in-game model. Absolutely crazy. Georg's design is the least interesting by far, but I gotta commend the attention paid to his ravenous maw and tattered fins. Twinmold's illustration relies on dozens of thin, precise lines to convey the textures of things like its exoskeleton, mandibles, and mouth. This is true for the red one in the foreground and, much more impressively, the blue one in the background. I'm not a huge fan of this pose, though. I mostly remember Twinmold for its sheer size when viewed from Link's ground-level perspective, so something that more effectively captured that specific feeling would have been neat. The illustrations of the various NPCs found throughout Termina are pretty strong. We've seen a ton of illustrations by this point, so I don't have many insightful observations to spare. As a sort of challenge for myself, I'm going to try to fly through my list of minor comments before King Zora can scoot out of the way. And go! They're adorable and I wish them the best. They only have artwork because their son does. Finally, a dynamic pose. Her head is still too damn big. Speaking of big heads, I admire him for delivering mail while lugging his around. Absolutely insufferable, especially this brat. I love his giant hat. I hate her giant forehead. The leaves on his wrists are so pretty. Monkey. Stand name, Darmani. I've never seen JoJo. Death. Just being this guy looks miserable. Tell me about Gabora. Why does he wear the mask? Love the variety of body types and colorations, love the detail on the instruments. The illustration is almost as heartbreaking as the side quest itself. Seriously, this scene made me cry. Haha, boner! That was a rush. Did I forget someone? Oh yeah. Well, anyway. As far as scenes go, we've got one. Yes, one. I am not kidding. Like I said earlier, there really isn't much content related to Majora's Mask. Still, if we're only allowed to have one scene, I'm glad that it came out looking this good. The thick shadows and the bizarchitecture in the background immediately convey the game's darker and weirder tone. Clocktown doesn't look anything like it should, but vibes are infinitely more important than realism in this specific case. I like the weird masks affixed to objects in the background as well. And there's also this voodoo doll for some reason. Okay, that's a bit too random. The sight of Skull Kid looming over everything and striking a weird pose while silhouetted against a bright, imposing moon is instantly iconic. Nintendo apparently agreed, as they reused it for the remake's equivalent artwork. I'll have more to say on that in a moment, though. The four versions of Link in the foreground are arguably the least remarkable part of the scene, since they don't exude much personality. Even the standalone shots were better in that regard. I'm also not a huge fan of human Link's expression. He looks vaguely concerned? Slightly traumatized, maybe? There's no sense of determination or urgency, he's just there. To be fair, this illustration was just concept art produced for Space World 1999, and despite my misgivings about Link's appearance, I still prefer this shot over its cousin from Ocarina of Time. The composition and stylization put it well over the top. Unlike Ocarina of Time 3D, Majora's Mask 3D uses an art style almost identical to that of its N64 counterpart, and for better or worse, it gave us much more artwork to sift through. Note that both versions' images were mixed together when I downloaded them. I organized everything to the best of my ability, but one or two shots may have slipped through the cracks. Link received a small number of new illustrations, including one for each of his transformations. These shots have a bit of the personality and dynamism that I craved from the originals. This shot of Skull Kid is also a bit more dynamic than its predecessor, and it seems to use a slightly richer color palette. Here we can see one of the few major differences between the two eras' art styles, that being the design of Tails' wings. They went from being sketchy little things to looking like they came straight out of Winx Club? That comparison doesn't seem quite right, but I'm gonna roll with it. My point is that they look too clean and artificial. The same goes for Tattle's wings. Speaking of minor differences between eras, the Happy Mask Salesman's skin tone seems to be a bit lighter. I prefer the original version due to the more interesting lighting. This version looks a bit overexposed. We also have new illustrations for several more semi-relevant NPCs, which means... I think it looks even more miserable in-game. My face when a website tries to explain how making itself worse is supposed to help me. Finally, we found the one Nintendo-adjacent character who can get away with showing more ass than Bayonetta. Nice pants. Loss is hidden somewhere in these indentations, I just know it. These women look like they're wearing pottery. Nope. What a smug bastard. Blow him up and make that the canon timeline. Friendly reminder that this guy only exists to wipe his ass with a landlord's paperwork. What a legend. I want those green shoes. Awfully serious illustration for a guy who only shows up twice in this game. This is upsetting. I want to bring him inside and give him a hug. I've always wondered what this guy's head looks like. Another nice hat, this time with tiny hands. Legitimately cool. I want to see more of these guys. Ugh. Majora's Mask 3D also gave us 3 new scenes. This shot of Skull Kid holding the mask is decently ominous, I guess, but his shadow looks pretty goofy with the mask's crazy eyes slapped onto it. I think it would have been better to have Majora's Incarnation or Majora's Wrath visible in the shadow instead. Speaking of Majora's Incarnation, here we have a shot of it, the Moon Children, and Fierce Deity Link. It's incredible. I love everything from the arrangement of the characters to the psychedelic colors that form the background. And after digging through a bunch of murky artwork of characters who went through so much misery, it's really cathartic to see a powered-up Link ready to slice that damn mask into ribbons. Finally, we have the artwork that served as Majora's Mask 3D's box art. I think it's my favorite out of everything we've seen for both versions of Majora's Mask. It isn't as stylistically unique as its predecessor, sure, but there's so much to love. Link has a more determined and serious expression this time around, and it suits the narrative much better. Conversely, we've got Skull Kid doing the exact same weird little pose from the last time. Again, iconic. The background characters, despite looking pretty cute, don't lessen the image's gravitas. The creepier underside, complete with a foreboding red sky and silhouettes of the Moon Children, serves as a reminder of the dread that underscores pretty much every moment in the game. The only other notable thing to come out of Majora's Mask 3D is this high-resolution render of the titular artifact. I like how it provides a better impression of the mask's texture and depth. And man, this thing just looks evil. Like, you can take one look at it and immediately know that it's bad news, which probably explains why my younger self was terrified of the title screen. And with that, we've officially lived to see another outro. Yay us. Once again, I made the mistake of thinking that a video would be easy to make. There were only 2 games to cover in any amount of detail, but I somehow passed the 35-minute mark without much issue. Someday I'll make an easy video. Someday. Despite the ultimate size of the project, I really enjoyed revisiting these illustrations. The Zelda series art style has almost exclusively oscillated between cartoony and painterly for like 16 years, so it was fun to look back at a much earlier, more fantastical era and appreciate so many shots that I took for granted when I was younger. Once again, thanks to History of Hyrule for ensuring that the illustrations reviewed in this video were easily accessible. Again, I insist that you go check out the gallery if you haven't already. And while we're doing calls to action, like, comment, subscribe. There, done. For those who care, I'm sorry for disappearing again. This hiatus wasn't as long as most of my past ones, but it's still been quite a while. On top of working full-time, I drafted a book, went to PAX West, met somebody very special, got sick, again, and so forth. Life really comes at you fast sometimes. Thanks to everyone who expressed interest in seeing more of these videos. It's super encouraging to know that I created something that people legitimately really enjoyed. As for what you can expect to see next, I think the theoretical Christmas special that I mentioned in the last video should be my main priority. I'm gonna need all the time I can get if I want to meet that deadline. The N64-Era Rareware video is also on the docket, but finishing that by the end of the year is gonna take a miracle. And whenever I do finish it, I'll finally be in a position to talk about the How to Draw Nintendo Heroes and Villains book. And after that, you can look forward to seeing many more render reviews and other analyses. Alright, I'm done. Thanks a bunch for watching, and I'll see you around, hopefully in the not-too-distant future.